Hi everyone. Welcome to the first ever Minutia Minute. I'm your host, Minutia Man. Hey everyone, Minutia Minute here. Thanks for watching this special 100th episode of Minutia Minute Comic Reviews, in which I'm going to do something we've never done before on this channel. I'm going to talk to you guys about comics. So I had actually thought about doing something a little bit more special for my 100th episode. It's coming now post my 10-year anniversary on YouTube, and so originally I was kind of thinking I'd do something different, something special, and then time just got away from me. I missed my 10-year anniversary, and I just decided, you know what, I'm just gonna continue on as normal and just do another episode and just make a point of thanking you guys. It's just always really great to see you guys on here. And even when I haven't been making videos, like I'm still periodically checking in, seeing what's going on, seeing what you guys are looking at, and it's just great to have you all here. And I think, with some of the things that happened recently this week in the community, it just shows how temporary all these things really are. And it just makes me really, really grateful and humble that, 10 years later, I can hop on here and hear you guys talk about comics. I can talk about comics. It just makes the hobby more fun by far. I just wanted to say that, and as far as I'm concerned, that's more than enough of a 10-year, 100th episode celebration. So that's it. On to the topic. So it took me a long time to get around to reading these. The reason I read it now, finally, is because I've been wanting to get through the 2-month Future State event, which is my stack of books right over here. I've pointed it out before, and I'm constantly having to qualify everything I say with, I'm not sure if this makes a difference, but I haven't read Future State yet. And I'm tired of having to put that preamble in all of my videos. So I've been determined to get around to finally reading Future State. But to do that, I wanted to make sure that I read Dark Knight's Death Metal. So why did it take me so long to get to this point? Recently, I sat down and I reread Dark Knight's Metal, which I was actually pretty disappointed in, to be honest. I talked about it at the time. I did a video on my reread of that, and it was okay. It's one of those where it's like strong concept, great art, but it just kind of falls flat. I remember my biggest critique of that book being that, like, over the last couple issues, it doesn't feel like the heroes really have any agency. They're just kind of throwing ideas at the wall until one of them sort of happens to work out. And so it just ended a lot softer than it started. That, of course, led me down the rabbit hole of The Batman Who Laughs and digging into some of the things happening with him in the DCU leading up to Dark Knight's Death Metal. And by the time I got to the end of the Batman Who Laughs miniseries, and I can't remember what series, it was in Justice League. There was a trade paperback of Justice League that featured him pretty heavily. Or maybe it was Batman Superman, actually. I don't know. I read a couple of those in a row, kind of trying to get into Dark Knight's Death Metal so I could get caught up. I was just so burnt out on the Batman Who Laughs. Like, it's interesting because, like, I think when Scott Snyder writes him, like, he can be a pretty interesting character, but it's just one of those where they just did way too much with him way too quickly. And so I just got to Dark Knight's Death Metal and I just couldn't start it. Like, I just had zero desire to read it. And so it sat there on the shelf for a long time until literally just a couple of days ago. And I have to say, I'm glad that I gave it the time that I did before finally sitting down and reading it, because I actually found myself enjoying this book. Kind of a lot, more than I was expecting. Hot take possibly, but I actually liked this better than I liked the original Dark Knight's Metal. I thought as an overall event, I think Dark Knight's Metal was better put together. I thought this event was more interesting, and we can maybe compare and contrast the two events a little bit as we get a little further into this discussion. But I definitely felt like this had more of a point. And obviously this was the big Crisis event for DC for 2019, so like it's going to have more of an impact. It's going to have more of a narrative through line because it's now the central book of the DC universe. But it actually worked in this book's favor, in my opinion, because the first one was kind of a lot of ideas, not as much substance. This put the substance in it. which for me at least made it more engaging overall. So we'll talk a little bit about the miniseries itself, and then I did read all of the tie-ins, so I'll talk about those briefly as well, give you kind of my final thoughts, and then I will include a recommended reading order. I actually kind of built my own reading order based off of several reading orders I found online, of which none of them matched up, which kind of surprised me. Usually there's more of a definitive reading order. The beginning is pretty definitive, and the end is pretty definitive, and the middle is kind of a little here and there. So I kind of took the information I got from those lists, compiled my own order that I thought actually worked really well when I read it. So I'm going to include that at the end. If you haven't read this whole series, or if you want to revisit it with all of the supporting material, this is hopefully going to be a good video for a one-stop shop for you that you can check that out. So Dark Knight's Death Metal. This is a much bigger, sprawling story than the original Dark Knight's Metal. So right off the bat, you've got Sergeant Rock, you've got Swamp Thing, and we're just dumped right into the middle of this DC universe that is completely different than the one that we left off in, basically with presumably Justice League, which is where they set up Perpetua and her relationship with the Batman Who Laughs and all that stuff. And right off the bat, I found myself getting a huge kick out of this first issue in particular because I just found it funny. There was a lot of great little moments in here. I thought that they took the concept of the original Dark Knight's Metal and built upon it to a degree that it was almost a parody of the first Dark Knight's Metal, where like the Batmans, for example, like the various Dark Batmans, are so ridiculous, and they always have some kind of cheeky explanation for who they are and how they came to be, that I thought it was just a wild ride. Like, I was excited about the creativity going into this book and the different Batmans that we were introduced to. And this maybe is a good opportunity to talk about like the structure of the original Dark Knight's Metal, where, you know, in the original one, you had the core 6 or 7 issue miniseries, and then you had a whole bunch of one-shots digging into the various different Batmans and basically explained where they came from. So in terms of like structure, the original Dark Knight's Metal was a little bit more readable in the sense that you could just read the core book and then you could go back and read all those one-shots and learn about the various Batman characters that you're interested in. So it's a lot more reader-friendly. This miniseries, as you'll see, is a lot less reader-friendly because you have a whole bunch of different supporting stories, which we'll look at later, some of which are really important, some of which are not. But where this one outdoes the original is because you're introducing all these ridiculous Batman characters, and they get these sort of one-off explanations and introductions, you're kind of left with the punchline of who the Batman is, where they came from, and then you don't dwell on it. Part of what made the original Dark Knight's Metal a little bit tiresome is they spent a lot of time kind of explaining themselves when it's actually a lot better unexplained. It's funnier, it's more shocking, and it's just a little bit more engaging. Like, you needed to know who, obviously, the Batman Who Laughs is, but a lot of those other Batman characters are way better left unexplained or underexplained. Now, as this run continues on, it does get a little convoluted a little quickly, and you can see right on the top here, you know, Death Metal is labeled an anti-crisis. They're trying to say that, you know, whereas all the other crises were about driving the DC universe apart, you know, taking pieces that they like and recombining them and creating new universes, this is the anti-crisis because it's undoing all of that. But at the end of the day, that is still just a rearranging of the DC universe. They're just choosing to include everything as opposed to some things but not all things. So I found the idea of it being called the Anti-Crisis, while I get what they're saying, it was a little lofty and a little frustrating. And where this book kind of falls down a little bit for me is it's a little too meta at times. Like, it really just literally is the editors talking to the reader, trying to sell you on the future of the DC universe, which I guess all these crises kind of do that, but I've really noticed it here, maybe more so than others. And maybe it's just because I've read so many of these now that, you know, it loses its luster. because they have had so many. I remember when Infinite Crisis came out, that was mind-blowing to me. Like, I loved Infinite Crisis, but it was my first crisis, and they hadn't done a bunch of crises in the interim. In this case, it's the 15th crisis in 15 years or whatever. That's a little extreme, but you get what I'm saying. And so, you can call this the anti-crisis. There's still going to be an element of, the laws of diminishing returns. Now, I held up on this page for a second because I also wanted to talk about another big universe-breaking event, which was the inclusion of the Watchmen into the DC universe, which I have not read Doomsday Clock. Actually, you can see it. I have it right over there. I'm open to the idea of a DC universe that has a crossover with Watchmen, which is why I picked it up. I just haven't read it because controversy, I guess. I don't know. I'll get around to it someday. As you can see, I've already got plenty to read. But I can say pretty definitively now that I don't like where it's left off the DC universe, because now you have all these Watchmen things intermingling. It's one thing to have the Watchmen universe cross over with the DC universe and have it be a one-off, but every time elements from Doomsday Clock or the Watchmen showed up in this story, I found it to be incredibly distracting. And I don't think it helps the DC universe. I think that, bottom line, like whether you side with Alan Moore, whether you side with DC, it's really, really hard to justify keeping the Watchmen in this universe. I think that DC kept Watchmen separate from the rest of the universe for so long that even though they've now merged them, they still feel like separate entities. And so when you integrate them, it just doesn't come off naturally. It comes off as, hey, that's Watchmen stuff in the DC universe. I'd be curious to know what you guys think about that. Like, I wasn't someone who was around when the Charlton characters came over to DC. I really liked the Charlton characters, but I just wasn't alive for when that happened. Or I was alive, but I wasn't reading comics. And so, like, I'd be curious to know, for those of you guys who were around, like, did it feel as jarring as it does to me when I see the Watchmen showing up in this? So as we get to issue 4, you've got more Watchmen references. For me, this is where the book actually really continues to ramp up, because, as I said before, unlike the first Dark Knight's Metal, in this you have various heroes on different missions all working together to kind of try and stop the Batman Who Laughs. You have the opportunity to visit prior crises in this, which is cool. I wish they had actually done more with that. It would have been fun to see them actually inside old crises, as opposed to discovering that those crises didn't actually happen because they've already been changed by the Batman Who Laughs. But nevertheless, it continues to be a ticking clock element, and they've got a clear plan that they're executing, and they're trying to make sure all these different dominoes fall into place the way they need to. Just a much stronger overall sense of story than the first Dark Knight's Metal had to me. The other strong point about it, as we're getting into the mid-run of the issues, is that we reintroduce Superboy Prime, who has actually a pretty important role to play in this, which I thought was pretty interesting, given how core he was to Infinite Crisis and everything that's kind of illustrated the Dan Didio era of the DC universe. I found him to actually be a really, really interesting character in this. Pretty well developed, although mostly that came from, I think, the supporting stories more than it did the actual Death Metal miniseries itself. Now, of course, this is only issue 4. We've got 3 more issues to go. They're dealing with a version of Bruce Wayne who has an answer for everything, and in this case, he's already seen what they were going to do, and Wonder Woman, Batman, and Superman have unintentionally helped him complete his plot to create the last 52. I thought that was actually a pretty great twist, and part of the reason why I think, the Darkest Night, I guess, I keep calling him the Batman Who Laughs, but Batman Who Laughs, Darkest Night, however you want to kind of explain him, part of what makes this kind of a great character is that, Bruce Wayne always does have an answer for everything. And while they've done this kind of thing before, where it's like Batman is his own worst enemy, they've never done it on this scale before. Of course, those of you guys who complain that this could not possibly be called an anti-crisis, I feel you. As we get to these last couple of issues, I mean, it really follows the formula. So I think that is a fair criticism. Now, if we're going to just ignore that and take it as a regular crisis event, how does it measure up? I still would say it actually measures up pretty well. It's inventive. For example, I mean, literally in this, what I'm looking at right here, we've got an army of Lobos working with Wonder Woman. Like, where else are you going to see that? It's more inventive than a traditional DC crisis, while still packing all of the punch of those. You have this wonderful Elseworlds environment with, as we keep seeing at the beginning, I keep kind of leafing over it, but this new map of the DC universe, which is shaped like a bat and has all those little key elements. Just really great in concept. So as we get into these last couple of issues, I figure it makes sense to just kind of briefly discuss the greater implications of the DC universe, which we are currently living in now, which is ultimately, this was a way to bring back all of the different elements of the DC universe into one cohesive timeline, which of course is mind-bending, I think, to most readers. I actually like the idea of the Omniverse because ultimately every book counts. You know, like, at the end of the day, like, all of these books did happen. You read them. You know what I mean? Like, whether the character remembers it or not, or that character somehow morphs into a different character down the road, like, all of that stuff does truly happen. Ultimately, to me, this is just DC acknowledging it and choosing to allow the writers to acknowledge the elements they want to or not in any given DC story. I think it really does open up the possibilities of what you can do. I think it's a fair criticism to say that it can be confusing for new readers, but only insofar as the writer makes it confusing. Like, if you have a good DC writer that knows, you know, the time-honored tradition of any comic book can be someone's first comic book, you can hop in wherever. Because at the end of the day, like, you know, if I started reading Batman in No Man's Land, which is when I started reading Batman, by the way, you know, there's a whole lot of Batman history, especially recent Batman history, involved in No Man's Land that I didn't know anything about. I was still able to pick that up, get the core concept, and run with it. When I read Infinite Crisis, that's really when I got into the DC universe as a whole. And Infinite Crisis is, you know, one of those books where it's designed to simplify the universe for new readers, but I found it a great place to just sample a lot of different things that DC had to offer, and I started to find what my other DC interests were from being curious and wanting to know more. There's no reason you can't just acknowledge all the history that DC has after, you know, what, 80 plus years of publishing, and let that be a part of the gravitas of the total DC universe again. I really like it. The only thing that would make me happier is if after this event they had just renumbered everything at whatever number they were actually at, as opposed to continuing to launch these, you know, issue ones of everything. Oh, this is kind of a fun page. Typical Scott Snyder likes to turn your book sideways. So I guess that's basically my thoughts on Dark Knight's Death Metal. It's a complicated book because it is, you know, so important to where we're at with DC right now. But it's also good on its own, which I was honestly surprised by. Like I said, like, I had been avoiding reading this for a long time. And I mean, maybe that helped because my expectations were low. But at the end of the day, the proof is in whether you had fun reading it. And for me, I had a lot of fun actually reading this book. And even though obviously DC is kind of a dumpster fire right now, people are not happy with DC. No one's reading DC besides me, it seems like. I don't think that's a reflection of the quality of this last big DC event. We can just only hope that they're smart and truly let this be the last 52, the last crisis, the anti-crisis to end all crises. So having taken a quick leaf through the core 7 issues of Dark Knight's Death Metal, let's just take a quick look at the supporting books. And boy, were there a lot of them. So there was a total of 17 tie-ins to Dark Knight's Death Metal. Now, I'm not sure how that compares to Dark Knight's Metal. I would imagine it's actually pretty close. But regardless, 17 is a lot of tie-in books. And these were not small tie-in books. Even these ones that are not perfect bound, which towards the end we get into some perfect bound books, kind of more in line with what they're doing with Infinite Frontier. Most of these are oversized reads. As per the content, as I said before, I actually really enjoyed most of these. The first one, Legends of the Dark Knights, and the Dark Knights Metal Guidebook do a good job of just kind of helping set up the universe. They're not necessarily essential reads, but they certainly help. And then about halfway through, you have a whole string of books that explains in more depth what each of the heroes' individual missions are and what kind of happens on them. So you get Trinity Crisis, which reintroduces Superboy, Speed Metal, which resolves some stuff with Wally West and Barry Allen and them running from the Batman who can run fast or whatever. I can't remember which Batman is even going after them at this point. This I felt like was tying up stuff from Heroes in Crisis, which I didn't read, but I've heard some things, which this was kind of going into some of that. Multiverse's End, Rise of the New God, which this was a fun read. It had some, one of my favorite moments, which was the Darkest Night and Perpetua throwing moons at each other. I thought that was wonderful. Obviously, as a kaiju fan, I always enjoy people getting giant and throwing ridiculous things at each other. And then you also get Robin King, which for me was one of the less effective ones, just because I don't care that much about Robin King's backstory. This felt much more like a traditional Dark Knight's Metal backup rather than a Dark Knight's Death Metal backup, in that it is very focused in on who the Robin King is, where he came from, just taking a lot of the mystique out of it, which, again, to me, doesn't actually help your storytelling, because these characters are a lot more fun when you only just get kind of a brief, goofy one-liner about who they are. Like, they're really not more interesting than the one-liners that are in the core stories. We've got Infinite Hour Extreme, which is a Lobo story. This one actually was also a highlight for me, just because the way... Is it Becky Cloonan? I don't remember. I think it's Becky Cloonan doing writing on this. But the way she writes Lobo in this had me cracking up. It was just really, really well done. Really Giffen level dialogue in this. And then surprisingly, there was only one major death metal tie-in in like the core DC lineup, and that was Justice League. For a supporting arc, this one wasn't bad. It didn't feel super necessary, but it is the only time you really get to explore the death metal universe as the Lord of the Rings medieval universe that it is. In this case, you have Nightwing leading a group of Justice League team members to Castle Bat to try and save the Legion of Doom, which made for kind of a fun little story. It made me kind of wish that Death Metal had been more of a No Man's Land event, in which all the DC titles switched to the Death Metal universe for like a year, and you just spent time in that world, because it did make it feel like there was a lot to explore in this, which was hard to do when it just tied in with Justice League and then was its own mini-series. This, by the way, cover by Liam Sharp, maybe my favorite cover of all of the Death Metal tie-ins, and maybe even the Capullo art on the core books. And then the Justice League title wrapped up with issue 57. And then the last few tie-in books we got were The Multiverse Who Laughs, which this, along with Robin King, probably are the most disposable of the death metal tie-ins. This just explores various dark multiverse worlds, not really adding very much, just sort of like little vignettes of what those worlds are kind of like. Didn't really care for this read very much. On the flip side, we got Dark Knight's Metal, The Secret Origin. This might have been my favorite tie-in issue, because it is very Superboy-centric, and you find out about Superboy Prime, where he comes from, what he's all about, and made for just actually a really compelling read that really made him a sympathetic character again, which, having been in and out as a villain of the DCU throughout all of Dan Didio's tenure, this did a great job of really grounding that character again and setting you up for the big finale that happens in the death metal title proper. And then the last two tie-ins, both of which ended up being Perfect Bound books, were the last stories of the DC Universe, which I also found somewhat disposable. Basically also a series of vignettes in which we just get to see the heroes one last time together before they go off into their final battle, having their little sort of celebration, that kind of a thing. Finally, the last 52, War of the Multiverses, one which is fun, although probably not necessary at all. It really just serves as just a giant dose of big battle scenes, basically expanding out on the big battle that happens in Dark Knight's Death Metal number 7. So if you like big explosions, this is definitely a book worth taking kind of a quick peek at. So to wrap up, I was really glad that I finally got around to reading Dark Knight's Death Metal. I'm curious to know what your guys' thoughts are down in the comments below. Having not lived this in the moment, I'm curious to know what your guys' thoughts were when you were reading it currently. I have the benefit of hindsight. I'm curious if my opinion has changed yours at all, or if it's kind of about what you thought it was at the time, or if I'm completely off base and you guys think I'm completely nuts for liking this. I don't know what the zeitgeist is around this book because I was completely separate from it when it was happening. If you're wondering which books to read, if you don't want to read them all, I'm going to say that obviously I would recommend the core 7 titles, for sure, definitely worth your time. And of the tie-ins, I would say Trinity Crisis, Speed Metal, Multiverse's End, and Rise of the New God are probably the most essential in terms of really getting the full story. To a lesser degree, you probably would want to read the Justice League tie-in, although I'm not sure this one is totally necessary. And then the only one I would really say you want to read just because it's a very solid, good read, Dark Knight's Death Metal, The Secret Origin, featuring heavily Superboy Prime and what happens with him. Very much a strong point. So that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on Dark Knight's Death Metal. As promised, I'll give you guys my reading order for the Dark Knight's Death Metal saga with all of the different tie-ins included. Of course, we're going to start off things with Dark Knight's Death Metal number 1, followed by Dark Knight's Death Metal number 2, giving me the opportunity to just really dig into this new universe, kind of get a sense of what's going on. And then Legends of the Dark Knights largely fleshes out the universe. It'll allow you to spend a little bit more time with the different Batman and get a sense of what this new universe is all about, which will lead you into Dark Knight's Death Metal number 3, followed by Dark Knight's Death Metal Guidebook, which again also fleshes out the universe a little bit, gives you a sense of what happened to the different superheroes and why they are where they are. Now, after Dark Knight's Death Metal number 3, you get a series of tie-in books that are actually semi-critical to what's going on in the story. So various different characters go on their own different sort of side quests, getting ready for this final conflict with the Darkest Night. So those are all in sequence. Trinity Crisis, followed by Speed Metal, followed by Multiverse's End, followed by Rise of the New God. And this is one of those things where this series is really annoying in that everything is in issue 1, which is just so confusing. It'd be really nice if this was just a mini series that ran weekly or something and you could just go pick them up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As it stands, they make it look like you can just pick any of these up in any order and read them, which is not really the case. Like maybe you could, but they're not really going to be very effective that way. So then we get Dark Knight's Death Metal number 4, followed by Robin King, which just sort of fleshes out the Robin King, which is set up in earlier issues of Dark Knight's Death Metal. You get Infinite Hour Extreme, which helps sets up Lobo's involvement in Dark Knight's Death Metal, gives you some fun character stuff with him. And then Justice League, which ran concurrently with the first 4 issues of Death Metal. I put further into the story because this arc wraps up as a lead-in to issue 5 of Death Metal. So rather than parse those out and try to remember what's going on in that story, it all happens very quickly, very sequentially. So I just read those all together here. So you'd read Justice League 53, 54, 55, 56, and finally 57. before hopping into Dark Knight's Death Metal number 5. And then from there, it's pretty easy, pretty straightforward. You read the last couple of tie-ins. So at the end of issue 5, you get the setup of the last 52, and you get to find out that the Batman Who Laughs has created all these different dark planets that are the dark versions of the new 52, basically. And then you get a sense of what those planets are like in the Multiverse Who Laughs. And then a more critical supporting story is The Secret Origin, which helps set up what Superboy is going to do in the course of these last couple of issues of Dark Knight's Death Metal. And again, this is like my favorite of the whole setup. And then you get Last Stories of the DCU, which effectively sets the table for the final conflict, just final moments of each of the different characters getting to spend a little bit of time together before the end, which is kind of a nice little moment for everybody. Then you get Dark Knight's Death Metal number 6, which is the culmination, basically, when the big battle begins, which is supported by the last 52, War of the Multiverses, which is basically the director's cut version of the big battle, where you get to see a lot more characters doing a lot more specific things within the battle and how it all kind of plays out, which leads into the big conclusion, Dark Knight's Death Metal number 7, which is the conclusion of the series. That is pretty much everything I can think of about Dark Knight's Death Metal. Thanks for watching this episode, and hope you guys have a great evening.